So I wanted to go ahead and record this lecture about regionalized America. I debated back and forth about exactly what order I wanted to go in, and I decided that I wanted to use class time to focus on some of the more complex aspects of life in the 19th century, things like reform, things like abolition, and even, Solomon Northup's story, and to maybe build a little bit more time of reflection in for that, as well as, and then kind of turning this part over to kind of a video part. And I haven't completely decided. I think I'm going to try to maybe break this into like two shorter lectures, because I'm covering quite a bit of territory. You can see here there's 20 years. And again, I really debated about how to go about this. It's a little, I guess because it's a presidential election season, I tended to kind of use the chronology of the presidents as a framework. But I want to emphasize that you do not have to memorize the order of the presidents. Instead, focus on what some of the big issues are. And so what I'm going to try to do is kind of go through what those big issues are. But you're going to want to kind of study what's in these slides, because there's a lot of information in here. Again, you hear the story or read the story. And so I'm going to try not to drone on. I don't want to read what's exactly on the PowerPoint because you can read that. But I do want to give you a little bit of background on each slide, kind of to give you some context and kind of layer it so that there's some information added to what's in front of you on the PowerPoint. So to start with, I want to have a quick reminder. You should have just finished or recently finished the lecture on Jackson, kind of looking at the issues of tariffs and nullification and presidential power and those kinds of things. But don't forget that we have a market revolution going on, and this is going to bring about massive changes. And we've kind of touched on this in class, the ideas of the middle class, and the ideas of the Second Great Awakening and transportation, all that kind of stuff. But just understand that this is pushing a great deal of change and new situations in the country. Sorry, my Yorkie is growling and distracting me. Immigration's increasing, which we touched on with the factory system, and that's kind of driving a lot of the changes with the factories. But you also see that it's going to really press some concerns about how do we define being an American, and can we trust immigrants, and do immigrants bring outside influences? This argument does not go away. It pops up on a regular basis in American history. We'll see it again in the late 1800s. We'll see it again in the 1920s. We're going to see it again in this year's election, right? We've talked a lot about immigration and that kind of thing and the need for reform, or the concern about stereotyping immigrants. So just be sure that you understand there's nothing new about concerns about immigration. And it's always a part of not only economic prosperity, but it's also a part of political concern. How do we incorporate these new people, and do they bring burdens into the larger society? And certainly you're going to see that happening up north. Of course, a lot of this is driven by kind of urbanization, which urbanization means, your growth of cities. And the influx of people, the factory system, and understand that when I say influx of people, it's not just the immigrants coming in. It's going to be issues of people moving in from the rural areas, people whose small family farms are not being successful, or who are struggling to compete. Artisans who are pushed out. You also have a great deal of technology emerging during this period. And of course, I'm kind of, summarizing kind of several different technological developments, but, the idea of the telegraph, the idea of steam power begins to really change the way people live. Gas lighting becomes a huge thing, and it's not in the early part of this period, but certainly in the later part of this period, you begin to have the development of kerosene lanterns, and that kind of thing, as opposed to just having everything being coal powered. And that's going to dramatically change things for people. And it changes work life, but it also means that certain jobs are no longer as important. As you begin to have steam power affecting transportation, that's going to shift kind of as far as global systems and that kind of thing. And you definitely see where the textile industry and cotton production in the South is going to drive even more trade between the United States and other countries. So again, we really have the beginnings of a globalized system. Nobody really is calling it that. But that's going to create some disruption. And so you've got lots of people moving into the cities looking for all kinds of things, whether it has to do with jobs or whether it's opportunity, or whether it's, hey, I want to be closer to my work. But when you start to have overcrowded cities, you start to have lots of problems. And these problems, are very common sense problems, right? You don't have a kind of a civic government the way we have now. You don't have scheduled trash pickup. You don't have a citywide plumbing system. In many cases, you don't even have a city fire department or a city police department, right? Those things don't exist. You have coming into, I think, the 1840s, 1850s, the very beginnings of kind of a fire department or police department in certain big cities, but by and large, it's very, very rare, and that's going to begin to create some real problems. And so just kind of understand that the North as a whole, and again, this is kind of a generalization, but they're starting to be very concerned about all this stuff. These different ethnic groups, one of the concerns about immigration, the 5 Points area in New York, if you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, really addresses this concern. A lot of this immigration creates tension between different groups of people. So that's a big issue, and that drives some of the concerns with immigration. Transportation will be even more important, again, with kind of the steam power and the railroad. And it's going to be in the 1850s that they start talking about the need for a transcontinental railroad, but we have a lot of territory to cover before we get to that. This picture right here shows you a picture of, I believe, what they called the 5 Points area. Shows you some of the conflict with the Irish gangs, that kind of thing. The Irish were particularly hated, and that's kind of, they were the first group that was really targeted, and we'll talk more about that at the end of this. You have the middle class becomes a real new constituency up north. This middle class begins to, first off, they tend to be educated, literate. They tend to have certain skills, whether it's as a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, just even a professional manager. Clerks. Most of your clerks were men at this time. You don't have female secretaries. And so what you're going to see is that these people have literacy skills that allow them to be informed. They tend to have some degree of education, and many times they live a decently comfortable life. Now, again, that's a generalization, and there's a range depending on what type of work you do. Some of them are very comfortable and maybe aren't rich in the sense that they still have to work and hold a job, but they're well-to-do enough that the wives can focus on social things. They can have help in the house and that kind of thing. But you also have middle-class people that just have a comfortable home and maybe can have one domestic servant and still work and still have to deal with worrying about money, but they can also afford to be a little bit concerned. Most importantly, they can afford to have some leisure time, and this is where you begin to see professional sports and theaters and things like minstrel shows, gaslighting. Again, one of the developments that if you look at this period from like the 1840s to the 1860s, gaslighting is going to allow people to read at home. So the emergence of all these different newspapers and different pamphlets and different books is a real surge in literacy. And if you kind of compare this to the impact of literacy and kind of the taverns and kind of the shared community information of the revolution, again, literacy is incredibly important in sharing information. We see that now. I mean, look at the amount of social media and how quickly news stories spread. This does have an important impact in the way people form their opinions. So as we're coming in, we looked at kind of Jackson leaving office, leaving things in the hands of Martin Van Buren. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending, I guess, on your political feelings about the Bank of the United States, that you're going to see that that Van Buren is dealing with an economy in ruins, and this is going to ruin his chances. So he's not going to be able to turn this into another into another victory. And the Whigs by this point become really, really politically savvy. Remember, the Whigs are pretty much just a party against Jackson. So there's a lot of variation within the Whigs. They're united on that one aspect, but they are not agreed about many other things. And this will eventually, this really makes the Whigs a short-lived party in a lot of ways. And so they're going to have William Henry Harrison. He was if you remember from Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and he's mentioned in 12 Years a Slave. He's going to, yawning. So Harrison will take the oath of office. He'll get sick with pneumonia. He was kind of older. And was, the election's pretty fascinating because they make it sound like he was this really rough and tumble guy, came from these really humble origins, which really couldn't be farther from the truth. But they certainly sell him that way. He has a vice president in the form of John Tyler, who is very much kind of your appeal to the Southerners and to the strong slave owners. And so what will happen is he comes in and he refuses to follow orders, if you will. He's not a good party guy. And so he ends up really doing what he wants to do. And for whatever reason, he seemed to, and he didn't claim, he claimed not to like Jackson. But at the same time, he ended up acting a lot like Jackson in this whole process. So he's vetoing things, particularly the Bank of the United States, which they attempted to resurrect during this period. So he vetoes that. He kind of has some run-ins with cabinet members and over cabinet positions and just lots of kind of your silly, Washington, D.C. wrangling in a lot of ways. And a lot of this is being driven by Henry Clay, who, if you remember, I believe is from Kentucky. He's kind of this great, really kind of the master of the compromise in a lot of ways. And he's the one that's the driving force behind the Whigs. Now, you're going to get to Henry Clay is kind of running, butting heads with Tyler. In the meantime, right, Texas. And I've been kind of hinting at this for some time. So this is when we introduced Texas into this. And I won't go into any details about Texas history because goodness knows you've had plenty of that over the years. But I do want to point out you had Mexican independence in 1821. So this, Mexico's independent. This is kind of a piece of, if you think back to the Monroe Doctrine, when he basically says around 1816 that Europe needs to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. They need to let countries decide for themselves, essentially, what they want to do. And Mexico is one of those countries. Part of why it's able to get its independence is the mess that's left after Napoleon, falls from power. And so Mexico wants to encourage Americans to move in. Now, part of why they're doing this is because, and I've mentioned this before, they want the Comanches. They're thinking the Americans will help push the Comanches out, and then they don't have to worry about, being killed by Comanches. And then part of it is that they need more people, right? I mean, they need people to come in, and they're hoping that these new immigrants will then become Mexican citizens. And the issue, though, is that Mexico doesn't like slavery, and we've talked about this before. And the other problem coming into this is that Mexico constantly has turmoil, like many new countries, right? And the U.S. went through this too. It's just we benefited from kind of that sweet spot in time where globalization wasn't quite as rampant as it was, and we didn't have any other strong powers really in our neck of the woods, if you will. But Mexico, however, has the United States just to the north. And Mexico's struggling to kind of balance its political interest to kind of make sure that they're managing this well. And so they have these turnovers between more liberal, enlightenment kind of guys that are anti-slavery on a lot of different principles, to guys that are much more kind of business-minded, that are like, hey, if slavery works, whatever, well, as long as they're not officially slaves, right, or as long as they agree to emancipate, or, there's all these kind of weird kind of conditions. So there's lots of changing their mind about what to do about slavery. And the issue is, Americans being Americans, right, we're basically going to say, well, no answer means yes, so they come bringing their slaves in. And really, there's a problem with enforcement. The areas of Texas that Americans have settled in are too far away from Mexico City for any kind of quick response when people find out about slavery. And you also tend to see that the Tejanos, the Mexican citizens that live in Texas, tend to be very independent persons too. And while they may not particularly like slavery, they don't particularly want to invite Mexico City's government to come on up and intervene. And we'll see a similar trend with the Californios later on. So what will happen is that by the 1830s, Mexico is starting to be very concerned about the presence of slavery. They feel like too many Americans are coming in, because remember, we have the Missouri Compromise that's limiting slavery expansion north of Missouri. So people that want to expand for the new cotton market that has boomed, and people that are struggling because of the boom and bust cycles, they're going to be attracted towards Texas. And so they're coming in large numbers. And so this is going to create some issues. And then when they try to limit immigration, Americans aren't going to take this very kindly. And so I do think that what you see is that Texas independence is very much tied to this whole idea of, you can't tell us that we can't come here, and you can't tell us that we can't bring our slaves. And, a lot of the narrative you hear about Texas often phrases it in the form of, oh, Mexico's government was being oppressive and they were being terrible and all this kind of stuff. And there's a little bit of exaggeration there. Now, keep in mind, though, that Mexico was kind of a hot mess. Santa Anna was not known for being a real personable guy. So there's some, it's not that the arguments against Mexico have zero validity, because there is, as in many things, a grain of truth in there somewhere. I just think that a lot of times the narrative gets skewed to make it sound like the Texans were completely innocent, that they were just, they were another manifestation of the patriots of the American Revolution. And as you should know from my class already, is that it's never as simple as all that. And it was the same way with Texan independence. So Texas, fights, and you guys are real familiar with that story. And in 1836, they have their independence, and they want to become a state of the United States. But that's going to be held up because of this whole Missouri Compromise stuff, that we have to keep a balance, right? We have to have a slave state and a free state, and this all has to be done a certain way. So the whole purpose for Texas being its own country for 10 years is not because we were determined to be independent. It's because the United States couldn't agree. Texans wanted to be a part of the United States. There's no question about that. So just so you kind of keep in mind that that's the backstory there. Now what will happen, fast forward a few years, as we fast forward into Tyler's presidency and that kind of thing. So he wants to be, he's not gotten along with his own party. His party's really kind of shunned him. In fact, they don't even nominate him. They nominate Clay. And so he decides that he's going to try to carve his own political niche by appealing to people that want to admit Texas. So he becomes this Tyler in Texas guy. And he's, makes it a campaign issue. What will happen is that the Democrats represented by Polk, are going to come in. They're going to endorse bringing in Texas as a slave state, Oregon as a free state, and that's going to kind of carry the day. The Whigs, on the other hand, at this point, the division within the Whig Party is really going to come back to bite them. That they're mostly anti-slavery, but at the same time, you've got people like Henry Clay who can be a little friendlier towards the notion of slavery, or at least towards, allowing it to a certain extent, or finding a way to balance the issues. And so what will happen is that the Whigs are, we're against Texas being a slave state, we're against this, blah, 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 going on, and then all of a sudden, at the very last minute, Henry Clay kind of flip-flops on it, says, no, we want to admit Texas, and, hey, this Texas-Oregon thing's not such a bad idea, and that's going to make people very upset. So you've got lots of kind of, concern in the Whig Party about what direction the party's going. And Tyler, at the last minute, kind of as his political revenge, so that his name is attached to something historically, because remember, most of his presidency was known for stalemate, really, is going to be that he has Congress, he has them kind of invite Texas by a congressional resolution, and so Texas accepts. And so what's interesting about this is Texas is unique in the way that it enters the United States. It doesn't enter the way most of the other territories, any of the other territories do. And that does make Texas unique. So when people talk about the unique background of Texas, there is truth to that. And there is truth that technically Texas could refuse and say, hey, we want to undo that, except I would argue that when they agreed to come back later, back to the country, or back after the Civil War, that kind of nullified that. So I think I'm going to stop this part right here. First off, I need to go get some tea, and then second off, I think I've talked for about 21 minutes, so that's probably enough. Most of you would probably want to take a break anyways, so I'm going to try to keep these short and sweet. So we'll pick up next with the next one, which I'll probably do tomorrow, really talking about the return to the Democratic agenda under Polk, and how he begins to change the way things are being done.